Okay, so we are in the second phase of completing the set-in sleeve. I just got back from the ironing board and I pressed open my shoulder seam and my side seam of my bodice, and I also pressed open the underarm seam of my sleeve. So when you go ahead and flip this to the right side, which is what I would do, you need to make sure that you first identify the front side of your sleeve and the back side of your sleeve, because this is what identifies if it's a right arm or a left arm. And for this example that I have here, I can see that I have my one notch in the front and two notches in the back. And so if I was going to physically put this on as a sleeve, this would be my right sleeve. And so when I go to insert this into the armhole, you want your bodice to be inside out so that the wrong side is facing you, but you want to turn your sleeve so that the right side is at the right side of the fabric, so that when you insert it, your right sides are together. This is a very similar method for kind of how you do a pair of pants also, by inserting one leg into the other and making sure that your right sides are lined up. Now, when I go ahead and I have this in place, the first thing that I want to do is I want to line up my underarm seam. So I have my side seam and my underarm seam of my sleeve, and then I want to make sure that my front notches of my sleeve are matching up with my front notch of my bodice. So if you have a sleeve and you have two notches that are showing up here and one notch on your bodice, that means you have the wrong sleeve. So you need to just grab the other sleeve real quick and turn that inside out and insert it, and make sure that your notches are matching up according to how your side seam and your underarm seam are lining up. So I have one notch in the front, and on the back side of my bodice I have two notches, and I have two notches on the back side of my sleeve. So I have the correct sleeves with the correct side of my bodice. And so what I first need to do, and this is going to be a little bit more difficult to do since we're working with a half scale sample here, but it's possible. It's just you're working with a much smaller space. So what I'm doing is I'm matching up the side seam of my bodice with that underarm seam of my sleeve, and I'm going to place some pins along that 5/8 inch seam allowance to hold both of those seams that I've already created. I'm going to hold those sides open. So I'm kind of lining up those seam lines and then putting a pin on each side of it. Then what I need to do is I need to find this notch that was at the top of my sleeve pattern, and hopefully you guys snipped that out. If you didn't, like when you place this together, there was a notch right at the top, and so what that does is that identifies where we need to line up the center of our sleeve with that shoulder seam marking. So it was marked on your pattern, so hopefully you were able to go ahead and notch that out. And as you can see, I have a little notch here, and I'm going to line that up with right sides together and have that meet just with the seam, the center seam of that shoulder, the shoulder seam that we sewed at the very beginning. So I'm going to go ahead and again place some pins just on both sides of that seam line and that notch, holding that in place as it should. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back down to the underarm seam area, and I'm going to gently and slowly match up these raw edges together. And I'm going to place pins probably at about a 1/2 inch mark, and I'm placing these pins, and I'm not for sure if you can see this, but I have my markings done with my tracing paper and wheel. I'm placing that pin right into that marking so that I know that when I go to stitch along that stitch line, that everything's going to be held into place, and I'm going to have a flat seam when I go to sew that. So I'm going to working from the underarm area towards those notches, making sure that that seam is flat. And I'm placing my pins maybe about 1/4 inch apart, just because this is such a small area. And then I'm going to go back to the other side of that underarm seam and work back towards the notches as well. Just again, putting those pins in right at that 5/8 inch mark and making sure that that seam is going to be flat. Alright, now I'm approaching those notches, and these are my back notches, and I know they're the back ones because I have the double notch going on there. And what I now need to do is I now have this excess fabric on the curve, the top cap part of the sleeve. And so what I'm going to do is I'm only going to pull on one side of these ease stitching thread tails. So make sure that you have those kind of accessible. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull on my blue ones, and these are the inside ones so I can keep it consistent. You don't really need to pull on both of them. You just need to pull on one set. You're going to pull on both threads that you did for your ease stitching, and then what you do is you're going to pull with whichever hand you have a hold of those threads with, and then you're going to gently kind of adjust those kind of ruffles or gathers that you're making so that they're evenly distributed between your top notch on your cap of the sleeve, the ones that are pinned into place along the shoulder seam of your bodice, and those notches. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to need to gather and ease this space in between each of these, between the pins that you've done on the top of your cap of the sleeve and then the notches that you've already put in place. And so it's going to take a little bit of time to ease these kind of gathers in, even though they're very slight, they're very small. We want to try to have as flat of a seam as possible. So you're just going to have to adjust with your, pinching your fingers and your thumbs together, your forefinger, and just your forefinger and your thumb together, and just slide those kind of ruffles and gathers back and forth until you can get everything eased into this small space. And I know that it's going to be tricky, but just try your best, and hopefully we'll have a fairly decent sleeve, a set-in sleeve when we're done. And then you're just going to go back, and what I would do is I would pull on these ease stitching lines on both sides until you can kind of get things somewhat in place, and then just kind of go back and forth between both sides with your ease. And then once you kind of get things in where you think that it might be decent, and I know that it's very hard to see on this video, but what you want to do is you want to try to not have gathers or puckers along this line. And if you need to, you can take those pins out of the top and just ease and then put them back in. Alright, now I don't know if you can see this, hopefully, but where I'm looking at is I might have some gathers up here, but what's important is that stitch line at that 5/8 inch, and I have my markings right there. So I'm going to start putting some pins in along the curve of this cap of the sleeve, just trying my best to keep this seam line that I'm going to be putting in as flat as possible. There's going to be some slight gathers, but hopefully not too many. And again, if those gathers are up near your ease lines, that's okay. We want to make sure that that stitch line area is what's flat. And as you can see, I'm putting in a lot of pins here because I want everything to be held into place. I know it's kind of hard because you have these thread tails that are coming on both sides of your sleeve, and it's a small area, so just try your best to manipulate this fabric around the edge here. And as you can see, I'm going really slow, making sure that I can get this seam to lay as flat as possible. It's a tricky spot right there, kind of right where those notches are, because my ease stitching has run out. And then what I'm going to do is now I'm going to go back to the other side and put pins in here. And again, if you need to gather up some extra fabric, just pull on those ease tails and work your way around. I feel like this side isn't, I'm on the front part of my sleeve, I feel like it's not, maybe not as bunchy as the back side. But when you think about the way that an arm is, or a sleeve is made, there's more room on the back side of the back half of your sleeve, because think about the motion that you need to have to be able to move your arm around, you know, like for your shoulder blade, and to be able to rotate that rotor cuff around and, you know, throw a ball or raise your arms up and stuff. So that's why the patterns are shaped the way that they are, so that there's more fabric on the back side, so that there's more room for your body to physically function and move as you need it to. Alright, so I've got my pins in here, and I have, you know, my ease stitching tails kind of flying all over the place. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to be stitching on the inside the inside of this sleeve, and this is a small space, and it's going to be difficult to see on my sewing machine, but the best thing you can do is go really slow. And so we're going to start at the underarm seam here, the underarm or that side seam of the bodice where those match up, and we're going to be using that 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to be coming back and trimming that up a little bit. But my philosophy is it's always easier to take away than it is to add on if you ever need. So I'm going to start right at that underarm seam and just go ahead and put my needle in, and I'm going to follow those lines that I have placed on here from my tracing wheel and stuff, because it's kind of bulky, it's a very small area, and I'm not going to do back stitching. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do some overlap stitches when I get back in there. Now if you ever need to you know, raise your presser foot up just to make sure that your fabric is flat, just make sure that your needle is in that down position, so that so that your fabric doesn't move around when you go to lift up that presser foot. Now I'm just stitching really slowly, following that line that I have on there, and it's not too bad because I haven't really hit those kind of gather areas yet. And the pins, take them out as you go. It's going to be a little bit more frustrating when you first start, because you have the pins that are on the opposite side of your armhole that might be jumping in and trying to like get in the way. Whoops. Alright, and like what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to slowly move your fabric around to the front so you can stitch a straight line. And if you're running into problems like me, it's because my pin heads are sticking out a little far. So if you need to, just go ahead and push them down in there a little bit farther until you get to that spot on your fabric. And then you can go ahead and grab them out. Alright, so I'm just like still stitching, following that line. Now I'm approaching the space where I have my 2 rows of ease stitching. So you should be stitching, you know, about a 1/16 of an inch away from that, because our first row is supposed to be as close as we could possibly get to that. Now if you approach an area where you're like, oh, there's kind of like a little ripple or ruffle that's going to be forming, raise up that presser foot, see if you can flatten it out with your finger as much as you can, and then continue sewing. Now I don't know, I'm not exactly sure how much I've got this zoomed in, but as you can see, like my nose is like right up to this because I want to be able to see where those ruffles or those gather kind of ripples are possibly forming. And so I am going slow, and I am watching every little bit that's happening here because I don't want to have extra kind of gather bumps in the line that I am stitching. Now there are some extra gathers along the top of that cap above my ease lines or my ease stitching lines, and that's okay because that's just going to be trimmed off here in a little bit. But we want to make sure that just keep that line where our stitching is. We want to try to keep that as flat as possible. I'm kind of getting to a space where I feel like it's kind of gathering up on me. Let me see if I can kind of ease that in with my fingers. I'm just going to go real slow. I might have just a little bit of a tuck in the front side. Hopefully it won't be too obvious. Nothing that I can't kind of press out when I get my whole garment done. Alright. I press those pin heads down into the seam so I wouldn't accidentally pull them out. And I'm getting close to my getting close back to the underarm area, and so as I approach that that seam where I'd started, or my stitch line where I'd started, what I'm going to do is I'm just overlapping maybe about 4 stitches. I'm not going to do back stitching just for like that extra bulk. I'm just overlapping, and then I can go ahead and pull out my sample and trim everything up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and trim up all of those tails because they have been driving me crazy. I'm just going to trim up everything and toss that in the trash, all my extra thread tails. Okay, let me look around, see if there's anything else that needs trimmed up. That looks pretty good. Now what we need to do is we need to reinforce this stitch. And what I would do is I would go around and kind of inspect to see if like you're going to have some like weird pucks or tucks. And if you can, just kind of give it a pull and see if you can kind of ease them out. And if you need to, take your seam ripper and just break those threads and then re-stitch it. See if you can reposition and then re-stitch it. And what I would do is if it's kind of like in that underarm area and it's very small and like no one's going to see it, I wouldn't like kill yourself on trying to get everything to be perfect with this, because you know we're learning how to set this in, and this is a very small area to work with. So if you have minimal kind of gathers and tucks, I don't think that's the end of the world. So mine looks fairly decent. I do kind of have a little bit of a tuck right there in on the front part of the bodice, and I'm hoping that what I'll be able to do is after I'm done, I can come back in and maybe use an iron after, like if I was going to be completing this whole garment, you know, like come back in and use some pressed cloths and try to get that straighten out. But now what we need to do is we need to go in and put in another row of reinforcing stitches to make sure that like this armhole doesn't rip out. And again, what we're doing is we're just placing another row of stitching right beside this stitch line that we've just put in, about 1/8 or 1/4 inch away, so as close as we can. And I'm not going to use any pins for this. If you feel that you need to, you can, but nothing should be really going anywhere at this point because everything's stitched down and our seams are together. The big part is just make sure that extra fabric from your bodice or the sleeve don't accidentally get caught underneath of your presser foot and your feed dog, so that it's just like an accidental stitching line. So I'm just going to follow that stitch line around, and I'm stitching between the stitch line here and the raw edge. I'm just going to sew about 1/4 inch away from that that seam line that I had just put in towards the raw edge. And when I get to those ease stitching, I may actually stitch over them a little bit, but that's not a big deal because a lot of that is going to be trimmed away here in a moment. And just make sure that you have those seam allowances. You're held onto them, and you're only stitching through those. You're not accidentally stitching through like layers of your bodice. And all this is just a reinforcing stitch to make sure that if anything were to happen with that armhole seam, that we wouldn't lose anything. And again, I've gotten back around to my underarm area, and I'm just overlapping my stitches again, and then I can come back and trim those up. Okay, I'm going to trim away my thread tails from the front of that stitch line and the ones from my back of that stitch line. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to make a notch into my fabric and notch out right under that underarm area because there's a little bit of extra bulk there. So I'm just going to take out a little chunk of triangle, and then I'm going to go along the second stitch line. This was my original seam line, and then this was my reinforcing stitch line. I'm going to go and I'm going to trim my fabric right next to that reinforcing stitch line. I'm going to trim it just right next to it. I don't want to accidentally cut it, but I'm going to try to get as close as I can. And make sure that, like my left hand, what I'm doing in here is I'm just making sure that any part of my sleeve isn't getting caught up in there because I don't want to accidentally cut that away. And I'm just going to go around as close as I can to that reinforcing stitch line. Get my hand back up in there. Alright, now I have all this little excess fabric here that I can just toss. And then when I flip this around, I'm probably going to have some threads that might need to be trimmed away from my ease stitching lines that I put in because they were on the right side of my garment. And so if you have those, just trim them as close as you can to your fabric. They'll pretty much disappear when you put them in there. And then what you want to do is you want to use your hand, and we're not going to press with this because we want this to be a nice rolled seam, and but we just want to use our fingers and press that seam allowance towards the sleeve. So not towards the bodice, but towards the sleeve, and then you can just use your fingers to go around and try to place that seam allowance towards the sleeve all the way around there. Alright, looking good. Looks pretty good. Alright, so what you're going to want to do is you're going to just then repeat this step for the other sleeve, and when you're done, you're going to come back and do a hem on the edge of your sleeve. And now, according to the pattern, we have a 1/2 inch hem on our sleeve here, and so what you can do is you can either work on the inside or the outside. I'm going to work on the right side of my fabric, but I'm going to stitch on the inside of my sleeve here. So I'm just going to roll that hem to the inside, and I'm going to use my hem gauge to measure it at a 1/2 inch, which was right about there. I'm going to do a double check real quick. Yep, 1/2 inch. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to place 2 pins in here on each side of that underarm seam. And then I'm going to measure just opposite of that hem at 1/2 inch and place another pin. Then what I can do is I can actually kind of hold them both really taut, and then it should keep the distance, the fabric that has been turned under, it should keep that also at 1/2 inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep that fabric taut as I stitch. And so I'm going to place my fabric that has been folded underneath of my presser foot, and I'm going to go ahead and lower my my needle. And what I'm doing is I'm just using the edge of my presser foot as a guide for my my stitch guide for it, and lining that up with the folded edge of my fabric. So again, I'm not going to do any back stitching. I'm just going to do some overlapping. And what I'm doing is I'm holding my right hand and I'm keeping that taut. I'm using my left hand just to keep the other part of the sleeve out of the way. And I'm just gonna stitch straight, keeping that fold edge lined up with my presser foot. And when I stop, I want to make sure that I keep my my needle in the down position. And I'm just going to keep that fabric rolled under, and I'm going to stitch until I get to that second pin that was just opposite. And then when I get there, I'm going to take that out, and I'm going to pull my fabric around again, keeping that hemline kind of taut and even all the way around. And then just finish that up and move that fabric as I need to in a circular motion. When I'm getting back to that starting point, I'm just going to overlap again. About 4 stitches or so, and then stop, raise up that needle, and go ahead and pull those threads out and trim all my tails up. Remove that pin. Let me see, I think I might have another thread tail that needs to be trimmed up here. Okay. Alright, everything's looking pretty good there. So now I have my sleeve here that has been hemmed. Very nice. And then what I want to do is I've gone ahead and I've done my stay stitching at 1/4 inch around this neckline. And I have my notches indicated where the 5/8 inch from the front is. And this is at the center front. I'm just going to fold that back the 5/8 of an inch. And I'm going to stitch on the folded edge of the fabric, and I'm going to do some back stitching here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run that fold line along the 1/2 inch marking on my throat plate. If you want to, you can use the folded edge as your guide and just run that along the side of your presser foot. But I'm going to use the 1/2 inch markings this time. Because it is a 5/8 inch fold back, and you know, by sewing it 1/2 inch, that's more than enough space to catch everything that I need to catch when it's folded back. And then I'm just going to trim those thread tails when I'm done. Alright, and so here's just a glance at that bodice sleeve. I have my center front folded back. I have my set in sleeve set in here. I have some minimal puckers, and what you can do is you can go over to the ironing board and probably use a sleeve roll, because this is a fairly small opening, and I would definitely use a press cloth and maybe double that up, because you don't want to have too much pressure on this sleeve, because we want it to keep this rounded shape. So use some steam possibly to help ease that in, but you don't want to put a lot of pressure on there. So if you don't need to, I wouldn't even press this. And that's your set-in sleeve.